doesn't seem to matter how many times you go over a manuscript or a slide presentation, there are always errors creep in. I found that. So the one in front of the woman there is an error, it doesn't belong there. And I didn't know about the room change, so when we originally scheduled it, it was intended to be in the new room, and of course, the master has pointed out what that's all about. Anyway, today I'm here to talk about Lozen, the female Apache warrior, and I represent Korea Ventures LLC, which is my company, and bear with me, I'm not used to PCs, I work on Macs all the time, so I don't know. Oh, there it was. Okay. Worked okay. Lozen was a remarkable woman. I mean, I have a book that's coming out that Tomas does not know about that I'm sending to a publisher next week. It's called Against the Wind, 4 Apache Heroines. And I'm only going to speak about one today, but the book, which should be coming out later in the year, is less than 100 pages. And it talks about some other fascinating female Apache warriors. Tatashte, Siki Toklani, and Goyen, along with Lozen. And there's a lot more detail about Lozen in the book than there is presented here. Anyway, who was Lozen? Well, she fought as a warrior longer probably than any male warrior in the United States, which includes Geronimo and Crazy Horse. She started fighting from the time she was from about 1840s. And Geronimo started fighting a lot later than that, so did Crazy Horse. So she was a remarkable woman. She was a great warrior. She belonged to the Chihene. It's spelled different ways, but it means the red paint band of the Chiricahua Apache, who resided in probably I would call it the central, southwestern part of New Mexico. The Chiricahua, of course, central, were located in southeastern Arizona. You probably all heard about Cochise. I'm just curious, how many people have heard about Lozen? Oh, that's amazing. I didn't think anybody had. Anyway, the red paint Apache were called so because they used to put red clay across their faces when they went on a raid or during war. That's how they got the name. And they were located in the Truth of Consequences, Ojo Caliente area of New Mexico. There's also Cañada, Alamosa, down in that area, which is along the riverbank of the river by that name, the Alamosa River. And their range really consisted of the San Mateo Mountains, the Mogollon, the Black Range, and some other mountains, basically in that area. And Lozen's brother was Victorio. I don't know if you know about him, but you've heard probably about the Victoria Wars that happened in 1879 to 1880. And Lozen was Victoria's younger sister, actually, by about 20 years. But she never really pursued the typical role of women in the Apaches, even though the Apache women were taught from a very young age. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the slide, because you can read it. I don't need to read it for you. But the young women were often allowed to intermix with the young men, young boys, from a very young age until they reached puberty. So they were able to fire a rifle, shoot a bow, run, scale mountains, and mount a horse from the rear, no saddle. Okay, it's pretty remarkable. Anyway, the Apache women generally it was a matrilineal, a matriarchal, and matrilocal society, meaning that everything descended through the female line, through the mother's line. And when a male warrior, married a female, he moved in with the in-laws. And we can imagine how that worked out. Anyway, as a result, the woman was actually considered to be more important than the male was in that society. And women actually had a bigger role in that society. They were responsible for childbirth and child rearing. They were also responsible for, since they were a hunter-gatherer society, for gathering berries, nuts, seeds, vegetables. They had some small agricultural capabilities, but not very much. Mescal from the mescal plant, just like the mescaleros, The reason they have that name is a Spanish name or a Mexican name. It means the people who gather mezcal, who were actually friends with the Red Paint or Chihene Apache. They live very close to one another. Let's see. When Lozen was younger, she was called Little Sister by her people, probably because she was the little sister of Victoria, who happened to be the chief, whom they called the Nantan. And so she, from a very early age, began to show that she was really more interested in assuming the warrior lifestyle than the predominant expected role of a woman. She did return to domestic chores when she wasn't on a raid or on a warpath. So she was pretty awesome. I'm going to read something to you. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the slides here because you can read them. I'll tell this one story, and then I'm going to read something from the book that I've written, which talks about Lozen among four women, and gives you an idea who this woman was. I mean, she was extraordinary. I mean, and so were the other women, for that matter. Anyway, she was, they say that she met a Seneca chief. Now, you wonder, Seneca, that's New York. Well, the Seneca, apparently at that time, they were under pressure from the U.S. government to relocate from New York. So supposedly, this Seneca chief by the name of Grey Ghost, he was also kind of, they suspect his name might have been Grey Wolf, came and was looking through the Southwest for another place for his people to reside under pressure from the U.S. government. At least that's the way the story goes. And Lozen met this young chief in her teenage years, and she fell in love with him. Of course, the love was not returned, and Victorio approached him, supposedly, and for a hand in marriage, and he rejected it. And as the story goes, she, from that point on, decided, well, that she would never allow herself to be hurt like that again. And so therefore, she became a warrior. Is it true? There's a lot of speculation as to whether this is a true story or not. Since most of what is known about Lozen, Victoria, Nana, and all the rest of them comes from oral sources, nobody really knows if this is true. To me, personally, it sounds a bit too romantic. That's just me. And I think that the story may have come about, it may be true. On the other hand, it may have come about as a means to offset any speculation that there were some other issues with Lozen, that she was homosexual, or that she liked the guys that she was with. Neither of which would be supported by the way that the Apache society was, because they were very strict sexually. They didn't like homosexuals at all. Matter of fact, they ridiculed them, and the same is true with promiscuity. There was no promiscuity allowed in the Apache society. So I doubt very much that that is actually the case. Nonetheless, this story supposedly is put out there because a lot of the red paint people did not want for many, many years anything to be said about Lozen because they held her in such high regard, and they did not want to listen to any speculation, no matter how prurient it might be. It just didn't seem that way to them. She was called, among other things, she was called Little Sister, but as she got older, she was called, and she started writing with Geronimo after her brother died or was killed. She started writing with Geronimo, and now those warriors were pretty fierce, but they called her the Apache female warrior woman. That's quite a compliment, because those guys didn't brook any kind of softness at all. They were tough guys. And I'm going to read a story here about to give you an example of what kind of person she was. She was also called the shield of her people by her brother and by Nana, who subsequently became the chief after Victoria died in 1880 at Tres Castillos in Mexico. She was just remarkable. She was called the shield of her people, as I mentioned, because she always put her people first. She was the right hand of Victoria, later became the right hand of Nana, and then later became the right hand of Geronimo, whose real name is Goyala, Goyala, or Goya Alta, which means he who yawns. And how did he get the name Geronimo? Well, they fought the Mexicans. They hated the Mexicans. Geronimo in particular, because his entire family, his wife, his children, and his mother were slaughtered at a place called Janos in Mexico by Mexicans when he was a young man. He was in his 20s, I think, and he never forgave them for that. In addition, the Mexicans would give a bounty for scalps. The Apache never scalped, contrary to what you might see in movies. They did not believe in it. Now, the Mexican people, the Mexican government, did put a bounty on scalp hunters to say, excuse me, they would give them a bounty if they could come and provide scalps. So what they would often do is they would kidnap and kill women and children and claim that that was a warrior scalp. Maybe some were. But in a lot of cases, it was women and children because they wanted the money. Well, that didn't exactly bring them to be loved by the red paint Apache people. So they really had it out for the Mexicans. And even Cochise, who was in charge of the Choconin Apache over at Chiricahua, over by southeastern Arizona, he for a long time was very friendly with Americans until he was betrayed. So one thing that you find out, before I get to the story here, is that Victorio and many others were actually betrayed many, many times, not just once. But there was so much ineptitude, there was so much bureaucracy. The Indian Affairs Agency moved from military to civilian. When the civilians took it over, some well-intentioned people, Quakers, took over, and they decided they were going to concentrate many of the Native Americans. When they did so, they put them onto reservations that were inhospitable, that even white men didn't want, and they even put enemies together. Go figure. Like, for example, you've heard a lot about the Lone Walkers of Navajo, who were who were taken to Bosque Redondo by Fort Sumner, and what happened there is there were about 8,500 Navajos, and there were about 500 Mescaleros on the same reservation. They hated one another. They were enemies. Just like when you go through and you study Lozen and you study Victorio, there were many, many attempts to put the red paint Apache people on places that the white man thought was okay, meaning nobody else wanted it. There was no mining there. There was no crops there. Usually the places were malarial. And even one place that they wanted to put them that caused the Victoria Wars to erupt. And Victoria finally got frustrated after many decades of frustration. They wanted to send him and his people to a place called San Carlos Reservation, which is in central eastern Arizona. Well, there was a place there called Camp Goodwin that the U.S. military had set up a fort there. And they abandoned it. Why? Because too many of the men got malaria. But it was okay for the red paint Apache. Sure. There was no shade there. There was no fuel. So when it got cold in the desert at night, they couldn't keep themselves warm. During the day, it was burning hot, 120 degrees. It was filled with scorpions, tarantulas, mosquitoes, other insects, and snakes. The soil was terrible. You couldn't grow anything. They wanted them to convert from being a trade and raid community and society into a farming agricultural society, but yet they put them in a place where it was impossible to succeed. Same happened at Bosque Redondo, by the way. So you really have to look at this and say, hey, come on. No wonder they rebelled. I'd be on the same side. I really would. I mean, the frustration is enormous. And you have to admire their patience. Anyway, let me read here about a section. This is in the book. That should be out by the end of the year. But this will give you an idea of what kind of woman Lozen was, because I've digressed a little bit. Many of the red paint Apache and Mescalero Apache tribesmen, who had accompanied them, by the way, were seeking provisions or acting as a rear guard to protect the fleeing tribe as it sought its way to Mexico and to safety. Blanco, the red paint Apache medicine man, was there, however. They had come to the raging Rio Grande. It must have been in the spring or the summer, probably the spring, when all the waters, the snow melted, The river was full and it was raging, pretty turbulent. So you'll see what happened here. The women were terrified because they had to cross it to escape. They would do what they traditionally did, and that is they threw pieces of turquoise into the engorged and violent waters of the river in an attempt to assuage its anger. Now, it didn't work. Okay. Blanco egged the men forward, but they became intimidated by the furious waters ahead of them. Now, these guys were not wimps. So if they're afraid to go over, you know there's a reason to be afraid. Okay, so what he did is he urged them forward. Nobody stepped forward. So even these tough and ferocious fighters were frightened. He then called upon any brave woman to lead the crossing. As if to shame them, Lozen stepped forward. She rode a magnificent and powerful black horse, exuding leadership as she dug her right heel into the horse's shoulder, causing the horse to rear upward. She held her rifle high above her head as she charged into the dangerous raging waters of the swollen Rio Grande. Once in the river, she headed upstream, and the cross followed its rider's prompting. The horse began to swim in the torrent. A small group of women and children, seeing this, and who had remained on the bank that Lozen had just left behind, started to cross the river. They greatly feared death by drowning in the rapidly moving river, but Lozen's bold and courageous action diminished their fears. They soon followed her courageous lead into the torrent. Wet and cold, the small group reached the other side of the river, but they were grateful and happy to be safe and to be alive. At one point, Lozen even plunged back again into the fierce waters to save a panic-stricken woman on horseback who was being washed downstream to her imminent doom. Her mission completed, Lozen considered the male warriors in the distance on the other bank, the bank she had just left. They were doing a rear guard action, protecting the men and women and children, the women and children, so they could get away. They were standing on their grounds against the U.S. cavalry. So her mission completed. She saw the warriors on the other bank. They were covering the retreat of the vulnerable women and children in a rear guard action. They were standing against charging U.S. cavalry, but duty still called her. So, Lozen turned over the responsibility for the group's safety to one of the female elders who happened to be Nana's wife. Nana he fought until he was 90 years old. Quite a guy. And then he said to her, "You take charge now," she told the older woman. "I must return to the warriors." Lozen then plunged back into the angry river, boldly and bravely crossing it one more time. She reached the safety of the original bank. Without hesitation, she raced off to join Victorio, her brother-in-chief, and her fellow warriors in the rear guard action. Now, I don't know what anybody else thinks, but I think that's amazing. This woman was amazing. She was incredible. So I'll leave that, but that gives you some idea of who she was. I don't know how I'm doing here with time. She had other skills though. I mean, not only was she good with a rifle, she typically wore a calico dress, which most of the women wore, long black hair. She had a cartridge band across her chest with cartridges. She carried a rifle and a knife. And of course, they had the knee-high boot-type moccasins. That's how she looked. She was also very good with horses. She could talk to them. She was the original horse whisperer. Okay. She was very good at roping and breaking horses. She was so good at it that she became a horse thief. And that was a highly prized skill among the Apaches. And so because of that, they gave her an Apache title. It isn't really a name, and I don't know what it is. I've tried to research, I can't find it anywhere. And it means dexterous horse thief, excuse me. She was also excellent in the use of a knife and a rifle. It's pretty obvious she was courageous and brave from what I just read. And she had great physical, moral, and spiritual strength, as well as physical endurance. She was also invited among the men to do a lot of the tactical and strategic thinking and planning for any raids and attacks. Her opinion was very valued, but one of her greatest powers, as they call it, was in the Native American, especially among the Apaches, the word power really means an ability. That's really the best way to translate it. So different people had different powers. For example, Nana, who you'll hear a little bit about later, he was known for his ability to find ammunition. Jew, or who's actually pronounced Who, resided in northern Mexico in Chihuahua. He was an Apache, and he was known for his ability to foresee the future. So you see, power in the Native American sense meant an ability to do something that others could not, and you were usually respected for it. In Lozen's case, she had a spiritual power. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. She was a shaman. I think we all know what that is. And I've shown here a sketch. There are no photographs. There's only one photograph that's known or suspected to be Lozen. I did this sketch here. Gives you an idea what she looks like. It's pretty close. But she certainly was a fierce woman. The word for shaman among the Apache is Gaan. That's what she was called. And she had the ability, supposedly, to see where the enemy was coming from. So when her brother was killed in 1880, she rebuked herself for not being with him at the time because she believed, and the tribespeople believed, that had she been there, she might have been able to tell him where the enemy was coming from, and he may not have been ambushed. So what she would do is, I'm going to tell you the prayer that she did in a minute. She would stand on top of a mesa top. She would face wherever she suspected the enemy was coming from. She would put her hands out, and then she would rotate in a counterclockwise direction. She would close her eyes, counterclockwise direction, until she felt a tingling in her fingers. So let's say she stopped in this direction. That would tell her that the enemy was coming from that direction, and that the intensity of the tingling and the coloring of her hands, because the hands would turn pink and warm and red eventually, would tell her the approximate closeness on a relative basis. They're either close or they're far, or they're very close or they're very far. That's how she did it. And she would pray to Ussen. Ussen was the equivalent of God. He was the main deity. He was male, but he was the overreaching deity among the Apaches. Now, they also have another deity, which we'll talk a little bit about, who was female, and she was very dominant also. So here's an idea of what Lozen looked like. She would do this prayer. She would say this prayer. She would close her eyes, and she'd say, "Upon this earth on which we live, Ussen has power. For locating, this power is mine. For locating the enemy, I watch for that enemy, which only Ussen the Great can show to me." Now, this prayer has been attributed to Eve Ball, who worked with Chihuahuan, who was a Warm Springs Apache, in a book that's entitled, you can still buy this, by the way, it's called Recollections of a Warm Spring Apache, and In the Days of Victoria. I think I have the title reversed. I think it's called In the Days of Victoria, Recollections of a Warm Springs Apache. And Chihuahuan was about 5 years old or 6 years old when all this happened. And he is actually the source of much of what we know about Lozen and Victoria and Nana. I'm going to skip this here because it's going to take too long, but you'll see that here it talks a little bit about who Victoria was. It was a brother. And Victoria, of course, means victorious in Mexican Spanish. That was not his real name. As a matter of fact, most of them were named by the Mexicans. Nana, who was certainly Victoria's senior and later became chief of the Red Springs Apache, or Warm Springs Apache, same thing, upon his death. And like I say, he fought until his 90s. I mean, this man was remarkable, especially when you consider that he was near blind in one eye, had a lame leg, and suffered from rheumatism. And yet, when Victoria was killed, he went on something called Nana's Raid of Revenge, and he covered 1,000 miles in 8 days on horseback. Try that sometime. Just an old man. He may have been an old man, but he was ferocious, and he was not the kind of guy that you wanted to discount at all. And he went throughout Mexico in that period of time, and they rode in excess of 80 miles a day. That would make it 9 days, I guess. Anyway, so here the thing is that he never had any more than 40 warriors. Most of the time, he only had 15. Anyway, Lozen accompanied him, by the way, on a lot of that. Other characters are Cuchillo Negro, which in Spanish means black knife. He was an earlier chief of the Warm Springs Apache before Victoria. And Quetene was he was a great warrior. His name means fights without arrows or cartridges are all gone, meaning he was so brave that he didn't even have to have a weapon. That's a pretty fearsome guy. He ended up becoming the stepfather of Quehuetla, who is the gentleman I mentioned earlier in that book. But he was also the second husband of a woman called Goyen. And if you read the book that I'm writing, you'll find her story is absolutely amazing. Just as amazing as this is. So he was the second husband. Geronimo, most of you have heard about him. And then Delgadito, which is Spanish for little skinny. And Mangas Coloradas, you probably heard about him. He was an earlier chief, 1850s and 60s. And his name is, again, Spanish. He was a copper mine Apache, which was a little close to where the Warm Springs were. And his name means red sleeves because he was a big man. He was 6'2" or 3 or 4 or something in that area. Anyway, he was brought into a camp by some miners and some soldiers on the context of doing a peace parley. They imprisoned him, tortured him by running hot metal on his bare feet on the soles, and then they killed him and decapitated him. Well, when the Apaches heard about that, of course, they were pretty enraged. Because the view that the Apaches have is that however you end up when you die, that's how you spend eternity. So here he is in eternity, Mangas Coloradas, walking around without a head, as far as they were concerned. So they did not like that very much, and that was cause for another set of raids. But you see, there was always a pretext there, as far as I can see anyway. Anyway, that's enough of that. I wrote this poem. I'm so enthralled with this woman. I mean, she's just so amazing, so as the others are. Their stories are so incredible. So I wrote this poem here. It's called "She Peered Across the Desert, where no one could there be seen. Yet she felt a present there, only one thing it could mean. So she closed again each eye. She felt the ground vibration. Her palms turned up to the sky, outstretched in supplication. She rotated round and round until she felt some tingling. Vague impulses she had found, some gazed and found it amazing. As she opened up her eyes, pointing where the mounted men would rise yon distant skies to come to kill once again, to wreak havoc amongst her own, bring deep chaos to their lives. Grief and anguish would be sown. She must help her kin survive. But Lozen saw their coming, in her mind's eye, clear as day, once more her people shielding, as death hastened on its way. She was proud Chihenne, so fierce, brave, and strong was she, of ojo caliente, with the red paint, Apache D. Ojo caliente, by the way, in Spanish, if you translate it literally, it means hot eye. But what it really means is warm springs. So warm springs, ojo caliente, red paint, Chihenne, they're all the same thing. Gila, Apache, Mimbres, Apache, they're all the same. They're just different names for the same group of people. So the Apache tradition, let me watch my time here. The Apache tradition was for women. Women were known to temporarily accompany their warrior husbands or boyfriends or whatever into war. And if a husband happened to be killed, watch out. It wasn't over, because the woman would go after whoever the intruder was or the instigator was. And this happened very often. There is another woman that I have not written about. Her name is Ishtan. And Ishtan was the wife of who was a Nedni Apache who lived in northern Mexico. She used to accompany her husband on raids and war parties. So you dare not cross an Apache woman. That's the bottom line. I mean, because they'll come after you. And certainly to seek vengeance. But usually when the foray was over, they would return to their domestic role. They'd take care of the children, whom apparently Apaches really care very much about the children. They would also accompany the men on these raids and provide the food for them and the shelter. And if the camp ever became raided, they picked up a rifle and participated in the fight. Very few adopted the warrior lifestyle as a lifestyle. They could go in it and out of it, but not remain in it. Whereas Lozen remained in it her entire life. And let's see. We've already talked about this. The Apache belief system, I'll go over that briefly and hopefully we can get through this here. I tried to put page numbers on here, but I had some difficulty, although another one I had none with, so I don't know what's going on. Ussen was the all-powerful chief deity. He was considered to be the giver of life and the source of all supernatural power. But almost equally important was the white painted woman, also known as the changing woman. She is the one who passed down the puberty ceremonials that you may have seen if you go down to Ruidoso Mescalero area. They have it every year around 4th of July. It's a 4-day ceremony. This is a ceremony that's actually celebrated by most Apaches. But she did more than that. She apparently passed on all of, told them, as far as the Warm Springs Apache was concerned, the land was sacred to them. They believed that the changing woman and Ussen had given them a responsibility to watch over the land that they were responsible for. They knew where the berries were. They knew where the creeks were. If you don't know where a spring is, you're going to die. So they knew the mountains. They knew there was a sacred mountain called the Salinas Peak among the San Mateos, I think it was, that they would go to, and they believed that the Gaan, whom you'll hear a little bit about later, the Gaan, G-A-A-N, is the way we did it in right, so this is just our way of interpreting it, were mountain spirits. And you'll see here that a white-painted woman became pregnant at one point, had 2 children. And one of them was called Child of Water because she apparently became impregnated by the rain. That's how she gave birth to this first one. The second one was the killer of enemies. And depending upon which Apache tribe you come across, they have a different interpretation. Some will say that the Child of Water was the progenitor of the Native American race that gave them the bow and the arrow and taught them how to live, whereas the killer of enemies gave the white man the gun, and so he wasn't really considered to be in their favor. But at the time that White Painted Woman was around with her sons, there were giants in the world, and these giants were like eagle and bison and things like that. They were gigantic, but they were evil, and they did not allow the humans to survive. So it was necessary to dispose of them. And these 2 children of White Painted Woman apparently did do away with them. So Child of Water is a culture here among the Mescalero Apache and the Chiricahua, but not necessarily with others. So you have to be careful. When there came a time when all 3 of them went up into the mountains, that's White Painted Woman, Child of Water, and Killer of Enemies, and they left behind the Gaan, the G-A-A-N, which is the second one, or the mountain spirits to look over the people to watch over the people basically and to guide them. And when you look at the puberty ceremony that some tribes open up to the public these days, you'll see that the belief is among the Apaches that the gods speak to the woman. Right? And the woman communicates, we have it wrong here. I don't know if they speak to the woman or speak to the mountain spirits who are actually impersonators. And one communicates to the other, and then that person in turn communicates to the shaman or the medicine man as to what they should or should not do as a people for their own preservation. So the Gaan are very important, and you'll probably recognize them. If you go to any of these dances, they wear like crosses, headgear, they're called crown dancers. Again, I've seen them, and oftentimes they'll come over, like I'm about to do with this woman right here for a guinea pig, and they'll touch her. Now, assuming that she was elderly, which I don't think she is. Anyway, the reason for doing that is that the stick, the crown, what would you call it? So it's kind of like a trident. And by touching her, what they would believe is that all sickness and evil would come from you and go through the stick, and then they would raise it up to the heavens and dispel it. Beautiful concept, really. So the idea was that way they would take away sickness and evil spirits and dispel them into the universe. One thing the Apaches were known about, better watch my time here, is they were very mobile. I mentioned earlier that Nana had covered 80 to 100 miles a day. Pretty remarkable. How did they do that? Well, the mescaleros in particular, and I believe probably the Red Pants did this also, ate a form of fast food. And what it was the women would gather mezcal from the mezcal plant, and then they would cook it and mash it. And oftentimes these warriors would not stop to eat. They just ate while they rode, excuse me. And one of the things that they ate was this mashed mezcal. This allowed them to cover great distances without stopping to take a break. They were usually armed with a knife, and a rifle, and a cartridge belt across their chest. Although sometimes they did carry other weapons, such as war clubs. You've probably all seen less than a week, and so you have an idea what that looks like. But those things are pretty deadly. I wouldn't want to be hit by one, I'll tell you that. Because they would frequently cause a concussion and crack your skull. That was the whole intention. The other thing that made the Apaches very mobile and hard to pin down is at one point we had 5,000 troops chasing less than 50 people. That's pretty amazing. What the Apaches did to avoid exposure and capture is they would head to the high ground in the mountains. They would put caches of food and clothing, calico, cloth, food that could be preserved, and arms, ammunition, whatever they needed in different preordained locations. So they would do that, and then in addition, they would use their horses only in the lowland areas. They didn't use their horses in the highland areas. They abandoned the horses and went north, went up. Well, the cavalry couldn't do that. They destroyed their horses by trying to do that. So that's one thing that they learned a long time ago. And they knew the land intimately because they'd grown up around it. That's why they never wanted to leave it, because the land had special meaning to them. It had religious meaning, but it had a practical meaning to them too, because they knew every stitch of the ground. Not only here, but in northern Mexico also. One thing that they did do is they did create two alcoholic beverages. One was really more for ceremonial purposes. That's the first one. It's called Tiswin. It was made from the sap of the mezcal plant. The second one, Tulipai, was made from sprouted fermented corn. And later, when many of these natives went to the reservation, they lost their soul, basically. They had no reason to live. Because how do you get it? How do you gain honor if the only thing you're going to do is sit around and do nothing? And on top of that, you were totally dependent on the U.S. government for supplies and for food, and oftentimes it didn't come. So most of the time, the native people were starving. I mean, literally starving. And so the leaders couldn't stand this. They would see the people starving. It didn't matter how much they protested or how often the bureaucracy was. I mean, if you're starving already and you say, well, don't worry, the food's going to come in a month, how do you think he's going to feel about it? You're going to die, because you're not going to last a month. So these leaders, what they would do is they'd say, I've got to do something. So they would bolt down to the reservation and they'd go on a raid, because the raid was the way that they would get the food and supplies that they needed. And they would temporarily keep the people from starving. Of course, the main thing, we're going to have to wrap this up here, was that their homeland was threatened. All Victoria and Lozen and Nana and all the rest really wanted was to stay in the Warm Springs area. They were willing to take up crops and stop their raiding and trade type of society. They were willing to do that. But the bureaucracy, the greed, the corruption, the changing of responsibility didn't make that possible. They were at different times told to go to Tularosa, Mescalero, Warm Springs Apache, San Carlos, and other places. It just kept changing. And then promises were made, but the promises were broken because most of the agents didn't stay around very long. Give it a year or two and it was somebody else, and they had a different point of view. So at one point they were told to relocate to Tularosa, but they didn't want to go there. They did go there, but they didn't want to. And they found Tularosa to be an inhospitable place, but the worst place was San Carlos. And several times, some of the people did go to San Carlos, the older folks who didn't want to do with war anymore, but the younger ones said, not only no, but hell no. We're going to die there. As a matter of fact, people would come up to Victoria and say, why are they doing this to us? And he said, maybe they're hoping we'll die here. That gives you a pretty good picture of how they were thinking. Okay, let's see. I mentioned San Carlos Reservation. It was called Hell's 40 Acres by the U.S. military. Gives you an idea. It wasn't their own homeland. It was in Arizona. I mentioned it was very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter. Dry weather and insect-ridden scorpions, tarantulas. How many here like scorpions and tarantulas and snakes? I don't think so, right? There was no game because the place, when people moved in, the game moved out. I mean, that's simply what happened. And at night, the snakes would come out to hunt, and you could get bitten and die. The military wanted these nomadic people to settle down, but never gave them the proper land to do what they wanted them to do. So it was kind of a failure from the get-go. Camp Goodwin, I've mentioned that. The U.S. had a camp there, abandoned it. It was in San Carlos because their men were dying from malaria. Well, if their men are dying from malaria, what do you think is going to happen to the Native Americans? They didn't care. They wanted to get rid of them. Extermination and annihilation was okay as far as they were concerned. Get rid of these bastards. They're on land that we want anyway. Excuse my language, I'm sorry. But I get a little upset and emotional about it. I mean, I read this stuff and it's so upsetting to me. But many of the natives said, well, we're not going to go there. We're not going to die an ignoble death, a dishonorable death, just waiting for disease or dependency to take us out. We're going to go on a warpath and we're going to die honorably. We're going to fight for our freedom and our independence. I can't blame them. I'm from Scotland. I know how that feels. Believe me. Anyway, she was extremely, she had an extreme allegiance. I'm going to have to wrap this up. Extreme allegiance to her brother. At one point, she had made all the warriors who joined him on the raid to swear before the raid that if he should be on the point of being captured, that they would kill him and eat his corpse rather than let his body fall into the hands of the enemy. That's pretty extreme. Let's see. She was a sharpshooter, and you can read these here. On a number of occasions, she went out when an ammunition pouch was dropped. Now, you can imagine they can't go to the local store and buy ammunition. They had to steal it. Okay, and they knew that bow and arrows had no chance against rifles, especially a Spencer rifle, which is like 5 or 6 shots. It's a short barrel caliber. It's more like a carbine. Anyway, they couldn't stand up to that with bow and arrow, so they had to get guns themselves and they had to get ammunition. And so when they dropped an ammunition pack on the ground, that was losing a great deal. So Lozen went out, crept along the ground, retrieved the bag of ammunition, and came back. Couldn't get killed. In another case, a woman, another Apache woman, saw a Mexican soldier go by with ammunition on his horse. She attacked the horse and the man, withdrew the ammunition pack, scrambled back to a ravine. In the meantime, Lozen was covering her with his rifle and shooting every Mexican who popped up his head. Amazing woman. Anyway, she was very brave, there's no doubt about that. She was highly regarded by the fellow Apache warriors. And I'll skip this, but here's another case where Well, maybe I'll say it briefly if I can. I'm running out of time. There was an instance before Victoria went to Tres Castillos where he was ambushed, that there was some mescaleros with them. And a woman whose name was Claude was pregnant, and she was wanted to go back home. She wanted to go back to the Mescalero reservation. So Lozen said, well, I'll take her. Now, they're in Mexico. They have to cross the Chihuahuan desert, which is pretty inhospitable, let me tell you. Not only that, there were patrols by both Mexican and U.S. troops because by this time, Tres Castillos was the first instance where U.S. troops and Mexican troops worked together. Prior to that, the raids would come from the north into Mexico, and then they'd vanish back into the safety in the north in the United States. And they kept these two nations separated. They didn't cooperate. Well, that all ended after Tres Castillos. And so they worked together to try to eliminate this threat as they saw it. Well, what did she do? She's riding along on a horse. She realizes that if she stays on the horse, because the woman's going to give birth imminently. If she stays on the horse, they'll be able to see the horse and track it. So she gets rid of the horse. Very intelligent. She goes to a bush. She delivers the baby. And now there's a woman, a baby, and Lozen. Lozen goes off and attacks a Mexican camp, steals the horse, steals the saddle, steals some blankets, some food, and a rifle. Amazing woman. She comes back to the pregnant woman, no longer pregnant. She puts them on the horse. She finds a horse for herself also, and they take off. And she delivers, over time, she delivers this woman and her baby back to the Mescalero reservation where she finds out that her brother, her older brother, has been ambushed at Tres Castillos. What does she do? She gets on a horse, she goes back across the Chihuahuan desert to help bring back the survivors. Now, some of them did not survive. About 65 of them were enslaved. They were forced marched down to Mexico City. That's another story. You need to buy the book. You want to read the book. You want to find out that. That's a story about Siki Tuklani, who walked 1,000 miles. Her feet were bleeding at one point, so were the others. It took them months to get home. That's how determined they were. Anyway, that's another story. We've talked about all this. That's a picture of Victoria, a sketch I did. And it's pretty good like that. Victorio, again, was a Nantan of the Chiheni. As a young man, he rode Mangus Coloradus and Cuchillo Negro. You can skip that. This is a picture of Nana, the 90-year-old guy. When he was fighting before Tres Castillos, I think he was 79 or 80 years old. Then he went and he fought with Geronimo, which case he was in his 80s. He died at the age of 96 in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. There's a little bit there, but his name is really Katsili, which means broken foot because he was lame on one foot. Nana itself means grandmother or lullaby in the Mexican Spanish. And he was related to, his wife was related to Geronimo. And he succeeded Victoria as the Chiheni chief. And again, he surrendered with Geronimo in 1886. He did escape from Tres Castillos mainly because Victoria was considered one of the greatest strategists among the Native Americans. Because when he was approaching Tres Castillos, he split his band into three groups, one under Nana, one under Ketena, and the other under himself. The one that he led is the one that got ambushed. The other two went out foraging for food and ammunition, and they survived. And it was Nana's group that Lozen linked up with later on and brought back. Had they been with him, the entire band would have been annihilated. You wouldn't be talking about it in Apache, who have a celebration every January, by the way, down south. Not this year. Bravery Under Fire, I think I mentioned some of that. There's a sketch of Geronimo. I think everybody recognizes the face, but his name means he who yawned. He lost his family at an early age, and the rest of his life, he was out for vengeance. He was a Badon Kehe band, which occurs at the headwaters of the Gila River. He did surrender in 1886. Who did he send to negotiate with General Miles? Lozen and Tashte. The Tashte were the two women, they were translated, and they felt, Geronimo felt that they would be less threatening to the U.S. military if you sent women, because they didn't really consider women to be very important, even in white society, or pale-eyed society as the natives called them. They just went, who cares? You know. Well, those women were as deadly as any guy, let me tell you. I mean, they didn't realize it though. They just did not realize it. This is the last known photo at the surrender before they were all shipped off to Florida or Alabama. And to give you an idea of the treachery, they were promised to see their families within a year. It never happened. The Apache scouts, mainly White Mountain scouts, who helped the U.S. military track down Geronimo, they were sent back east also as prisoners. So it didn't matter that you cooperated. Because you were an Apache, any Apache is an Apache. Get rid of them. Well, it turned out that Lozen was quickly sent to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, and she was exposed to tuberculosis. She died at the age of about 50, which is pretty tragic, because here's this woman who died ingloriously, unknown, of a disease, a white man's disease of all things. She was certainly no longer independent. She was no longer free. It's a sad story, really. I mean, when you think about it. That's, oh, I'm sorry. No, she's in the back row. Can you follow my finger right up closest to the railroad?
Yeah.
She kind of turns sort of sideways and has a string of hair in front of her face, right above here.
Behind the guy with the vest.
Yes. Yeah, she's in the back row. 1, 2. If you, the back row has 4 women. 1, 2. She's the third woman. That's the only known picture of her, and there was a lot of controversy about whether that really is her. However, the Tashte, who was one of the negotiators of the surrender, was at there. As a matter of fact, I think she's the woman right next to her, on her left, our right. She knew Lozen intimately, so she said, no, she was there during this picture, so I would take her word over anybody's. But there is controversy about that. Now, let's see. Inglorious End, I think I mentioned that. She was known as Shield of the People. What happened? We can skip that. These are some references, books that talk about it. I would highly recommend, these are nonfiction books. In the Days of Victoria, the first one is excellent. Warrior Woman is quite good. It doesn't have an index, however, but it reads really well. The other two, Women of the Apache Nation, of those two, Apache Women Warriors by Buchanan is actually the better book. It's smaller, but it's packed with information. And then there's some others there. And over here I have indicated some fictional books, Ghost Warriors and Avenging, and of the two, I prefer the second. The first one is about 500 pages, and I don't know how folks are here, but I don't really prefer fiction. I prefer nonfiction because they get bored. You know, 50 pages into something, oh, I don't really care if the trees were rustling. You know, I mean, that's in your head anyway. It's not even real. You know, now if you tell me something real, I'm interested in that. But I'm not interested in things that are fictional because it's imagination. That's just me. But anyway, I want to thank you all. Are there any questions, first of all? Yes, ma'am.
What about the Apache use of the warm springs? And also San Carlos has a warm spring on it. Also. The Apaches did use the warm springs. It was one of the things that attracted them to that area. But it wasn't just that area, it was the entire area around it as well as that. And they considered it all sacred. And San Carlos might have had warm springs, but it was so inhospitable in every other regard that, I mean, lots of people died because it's such a terrible place. Whereas they knew the Warm Springs area, they knew Cañada Alamosa and that area. They knew where every twig was. They knew where every berry was, every creek, because water was very important in those areas. Whereas they didn't know any of that in San Carlos. When it's the same as Scotland. A mountain is associated with history. It's associated with folklore, and it's associated with your belief system. And so when you remove somebody from that area, you're doing more than just physically removing them. You're tearing them away from everything they've ever known and identified with. So it's quite a different thing. But yeah, they did go to the warm spring.
Would the men and women take the waters together, or?
Now that I don't know. I doubt it. Knowing what I know about the Apache Society, I really doubt it, because they also had some laws which kind of broke down in the years of survival, where a young man didn't even look or talk to his mother-in-law. Now, if that's the way they felt, I doubt they went and took a bath together in the warm springs. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would say 99% I'm pretty sure on that. Anything else, please? Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you found it informative. I'm just going to do some